The Battle of Island Mound, the first Kansas at war. It was January 1862, and George Washington, not the founding father, but a man born into bondage, had reached his breaking point. His master, Jesse, had started chaining him up at night. Not because George had done anything wrong, but because Jesse had heard rumors slaves were escaping to Kansas. And Jesse knew George had that look in his eye, the look of a man who'd tasted hope. George didn't just run, he walked. Across frozen ground, across the border, across the line between slavery and freedom. He was lucky. The ice held, the patrols missed him, and the cold didn't kill him. But luck alone didn't carry him. It was resolve. It was the fire in his chest that said, "I am not property. I am a man." George didn't know a soul in Kansas. He made it to Quindaro, a river town known as a haven for freedom seekers. There he found work at a riverboat landing, honest labor paid in coin, not cruelty. For the first time, he earned his keep. For the first time, he stood tall. And then he heard something extraordinary: the formation of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry, a regiment of black men, many of them escaped slaves, being trained and armed to fight for the Union, to fight for freedom. George made his way to Fort Leavenworth. He couldn't read or write, but he could make his mark. And when he did, it meant something. It meant he was no longer property. He was a soldier, a free man, good as any other. He marched, he wore Union blue, and every stitch of that uniform felt like armor against the past. He was proud, he was peaceful, he was powerful. Then came the orders. He and 220 other black soldiers were to march back into Missouri, the land they had escaped. Why? Because the Union needed them. Because the enemy was stirring. Because freedom wasn't just something you claimed, it was something you defended. They marched into Bates County, near Butler, Missouri. Their mission: stop the bushwhackers, pro-Confederate guerrillas who were terrorizing the border. These men weren't regular soldiers. They were raiders, arsonists, kidnappers. They burned homes, shot Union sympathizers, and snatched escaped slaves back into bondage. Miles back over that border, the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry marched into the open prairie. They were barely free men, some only months removed from chains, and most had never held a musket before joining up. Yet here they were, wearing Union blue, rifles on their shoulders, marching with purpose. White Missourians stared in disbelief. To them, the only black men they had ever seen were slaves. Now those same men were soldiers, armed and organized, ready to fight for Old Glory. The sight alone was revolutionary, but the mission was deadly serious. Bushwhackers, pro-Confederate guerrillas, were wreaking havoc in Bates County. They burned houses, shot Union sympathizers, and hunted escaped slaves like hounds on a trail. Rumor had it they were camped in force on a swamp island called Hog Island, hundreds strong. By the time the regiment reached the Toothman farm, scouts of the bushwhackers had already appeared, circling like vultures. Trouble was near. You could feel it in the air. The Toothman family were staunch rebels. Their younger son was already imprisoned at Fort Lincoln for fighting with guerrillas. When the 1st Kansas marched up, the women of the house froze. An army of black Union soldiers, something they had never imagined, was about to take over their home. Captain Ward questioned them about the bushwhackers. The answer chilled the men to the bone. 700 rebel horsemen on Hog Island, just a couple miles over those hills. 700 against 200. The odds were staggering. Some soldiers whispered that maybe the women were lying, trying to scare them off. But locals confirmed the same. Outnumbered, outgunned, and deep in hostile territory, the 1st Kansas had no choice but to stand their ground. They raised the Union flag outside the Toothman house. This was no longer a rebel farm. It was a Union camp. And the men gave it a name that carried pride and defiance: Fort Africa. The name was a declaration. These were men who had been enslaved, dismissed, and doubted. Now they were soldiers, free men, defending their own fort. White skeptics said they would scatter at the first shot, but the men of the 1st Kansas were young, proud, and determined to prove otherwise. Were they scared? Of course. Only a fool wouldn't be. The first night, the reality sank in. They were outnumbered, inexperienced, and facing enemies who had sworn to take no prisoners. Capture meant death, or worse, being dragged back into slavery. But fear sharpened resolve. They had earned freedom the hard way, and they would risk everything to keep it. Better to die on the prairie as a soldier than live again in chains. At dawn, scouts rode out again. This time, they saw them. Bushwhackers gathering in numbers, swarming like hornets on a nest. The alarm spread quickly. Officers knew the fight was coming. The regiment was short on food, but the captain understood the deeper danger. The bushwhackers would never tolerate black soldiers in Union blue. He ordered a large forage party to gather supplies, while sharpshooters were sent forward to harass the rebels and keep them occupied. The prairie was alive with tension. Rebel voices carried across the fields, their yelling growing louder, especially aimed at the officers. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the promise of battle. The bushwhackers came at them with revolvers, flashy pistols, deadly up close, but laughably useless at 300 yards. The 1st Kansas-colored infantry had rifles, and they knew how to use them. Volley after volley cracked across the prairie, and saddles emptied fast. Rebels who thought they were chasing frightened men suddenly found themselves chased instead, galloping back in disarray. For the first time, the guerrillas realized these black soldiers weren't going to run. They were going to fight, and they were going to win. But the bushwhackers weren't done. As the 1st Kansas marched back toward camp, the rebels shadowed them, setting fires along the way. Smoke rolled across the prairie, thick enough to blot out the sun. By the time the men sat down for lunch at Fort Africa, they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. The captain grew nervous. He knew the rebels were out there, hiding in the haze. He sent out scouts, among them a Cherokee named John Sixkiller, once enslaved himself, now a Union soldier. Shots rang out in the distance. Trouble was brewing. Company F was dispatched to bring the scouts back. But as they pushed farther from camp, the men felt it. Eyes watching from the trees, shadows moving in the smoke. The prairie was too open, too exposed. Every step felt like walking into a trap. And then it came. The sound of fury itself. Rebel horsemen, more than 100 strong, charging over the hill with all the fire of hell. Lieutenant Gardner's voice cut through the chaos. Form ranks, aim. Life came down to that single moment. Men stared into the eyes of the enemy as they thundered closer. Muskets fired, smoke and flames swallowed the hill. Gardner was shot twice, crawling for his life. Captain Crew was hit again and again, refusing to fall until the last bullet struck him dead. The bushwhackers hated the officers most. They wanted to break the leadership, to scatter the men, but the 1st Kansas held together. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted, smoke choked the air. Rifles fired once, maybe twice, before the fighting turned brutal and close. Soldiers grabbed whatever they could, bayonets, fists, even bare hands, to fight off the rebels. Sergeant Lowry was shot and told to surrender. His answer was steel. He kept fighting, one after another, refusing to give up. For a moment, it seemed the 1st Kansas-colored infantry might be swallowed whole. But Captain Ward was no fool. He rallied fresh men, cut across the rebel flank, and drove them back over the mound and toward the river. The bushwhackers had expected an easy kill. Instead, they found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outlasted. By the time the Union volleys tore through their ranks, the rebels had had enough. They broke, retreating in disarray. White skeptics had sneered that black men wouldn't fight, that they would scatter at the first shot. Island Mound proved them wrong. 8 Union men lay dead, 11 more wounded. But the survivors fought like tigers, clawing for freedom with every shot, every bayonet thrust, every breath. They weren't just fighting for the Union, they were fighting for themselves, for their families, for the right to live as free men. Private Dobson, only 14 years old, was shot in both arms. Bleeding and broken, he told Captain Morrell he had killed just one rebel, but he was proud he had brought his rifle back. That rifle was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of defiance. Word of Island Mound spread quickly. Reports reached Washington, and some say President Lincoln himself thought of the 1st Kansas when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation and when he opened the Union Army to black soldiers. Island Mound wasn't just a skirmish. It was a turning point. It showed that African Americans could fight, bleed, and die for freedom, and that their courage could help win the war. The story didn't end on the battlefield. Families carried it forward. George Washington, born enslaved in Virginia, once told by his master he was like a son, only to be threatened with chains. On a frozen night, He and others walked across the Missouri River to freedom, just like Jesus, as his granddaughter remembered. George became a soldier, earning $9 or $10 a month, buying his own rifle and uniform, and proving himself in battle. Joseph, a Quaker abolitionist, became a lieutenant in Company F. Within minutes of the fight, he was shot in the thigh and knee, nearly killed by buckshot. His assailant's bad ammunition, or Joseph's thick skull, saved him. He survived, scarred but unbroken. Corporal Rufus Vann, a free man of color, joined proudly. He had already been freed by his former owner, Katie Williams. Rufus and others polished their buttons, folded their uniforms with care, and wore Union blue with pride. For them, the uniform was more than cloth. It was dignity. Many of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry would not live to see the end of the war. But something changed forever that day. They showed who they were. They showed they were worth something. They showed they were men, free men, never going back. Island Mound was the beginning of a legacy, a moment when courage shattered prejudice, when sacrifice opened doors, and when freedom was defended not just in words but in blood. And so, dear viewer, Island Mound was more than a battle. It was a declaration, a promise, a legacy carried in family stories, in polished buttons, in rifles held high. It was the day the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry stood their ground and changed the course of history.